Make his head go around so fast that it spins off. R4 is really an R2 painted red, isn't it?
Careful what you're saying about R4, because you can get bopped on the head real quick.
If you haven't seen the video I did on The Phantom Menace earlier this year, you should definitely check that out. It's part 1 in this longest fuck series where I analyze each and every Star Wars movie in exhaustive detail, and if that sounds exciting to you, you're a fucking nerd. Welcome to the channel. I don't want to waste any time with preambles since I already went over what I aim to accomplish in the last video, but I figure since we're talking about Attack of the Clones, we need to lay down some ground rules. It goes without saying that this is the movie that kicks off the Clone Wars, something that fans have been waiting ever since 1977 to get some more backstory on, and an era that nowadays has so much supplementary content I wouldn't even know where to begin talking about it. Well, actually I do, and I have, but seeing as I've already said my piece on the Clone Wars, I wanted to be clear that I will not be using anything from that show as a reference for or against this film. I believe in judging things as they exist in the context of when they were made, so things like the OT and the Phantom Menace matter when assessing how Attack of the Clones fits into the world of Star Wars, but nothing after the fact. And certainly not supplementary material. I say this now because I know a lot of people are going to try to counter some of my points with things like, the Clone Wars says this, and you're welcome to do so, just as I'm welcome to scream into a void that I don't want to do my taxes. Uncle Sam doesn't care, and neither do I. Besides, you're welcome to use the Clone Wars to defend this movie all you want, but all I have to do is counter with all the ways in which that show damages the larger Star Wars canon, so two can play at that game. And like I said, no supplementary material, as always. You guys know I love the books, and it always irks me when they get trampled on, but I've been consistent in trying to judge these movies based on their own merits and how they connect to each other, so I could go on about how, for example, this movie completely retconned Boba Fett's backstory from the EU, but I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna take what this movie establishes about that character at face value and judge it as is. I mean, it's still not very good, but we'll get into that. And one last thing. In my Phantom Menace video, I basically just went through the movie chronologically and broke down the plot that way, and that's because the story is relatively simple and straightforward. But Attack of the Clones is notorious for having a really convoluted and confusing plot, and the simple task of trying to unravel it and line it all up is going to be kind of tricky. So I figured before we can talk about things like characters, themes, world building, and all that other fun stuff, first we need to establish what actually happens in this movie, what all the involved characters know at the beginning and by the end, and how all that tracks. You might think you have a decent understanding of the plot of this movie and that I'm just being ridiculous, but every time I sit down and have someone try to explain it to me, they end up realizing how little sense any of it makes, and so that's what this part of the review is meant to clear up. It doesn't help that a lot of these same people who misunderstand this movie have made reviews of their own, and that's caused this misinformation to spread to the masses in ways that can no longer be contained.
Palpatine sends a man, who sends a man, who sends a shapeshifter, who sends a robot, who sends bugs to go kill Padme!
At this point, all I can do is try to work through it myself, and any of you who want to join in on the fun are welcome to watch me lose my fucking mind. Let's take that cosmonaut clip I just played for you as a starting point. I didn't want to bring him up again in this video because I already spent a fair bit of time lambasting his and Plinkett's reviews in the last one, but watching Cosmonaut's review of Attack of the Clones made it crystal clear to me just how confused a lot of people are by the plot of this film. I'm not even particularly blaming Cosmonaut for not getting it either, but he does get a lot of things wrong.
So in this movie, Palpatine is trying to kill Padme. But why? Padme is going to make things difficult, so he has to kill her. But he messes up and doesn't kill her. But that's okay. He actually wants Anakin to get close to her and fall in love. But then he tries to have her killed anyway, right after that. You're really lucky that none of these Pokemon ate her, because then Anakin would just be a good guy forever, and your plan wouldn't work.
This is, I think, the most important thing to try to clear up if we expect to make any sense of this story. Does Palpatine want Padme dead? Now, prequel fans will quickly jump in to counter that the assassination attempts are being done by Dooku on behalf of Newt Gunray, who wants her dead because they have beef from the last movie.
What about the senator from Naboo? Is she dead yet? I'm not signing your treaty until I have her head on my desk.
I am a man of my word, Viceroy.
And that is true. Gunray wants her dead, and Dooku has no problems killing her because she's the one leading the movement in the Senate to vote against creating an army. Obviously, Dooku wants the war to break out, so that's a no-go. But it still ultimately comes down to Palpatine. If he thought for even a moment that Padme dying would impede his plans in the grand scheme of things, he wouldn't have let Dooku agree to that deal. They would have just had to figure out some other way to get Gunray to pledge his support. So it stands to reason that Palpatine is happy to let Padme die, but let's look at what that means for his goals fails if he does. Ultimately, what Palpatine wants to accomplish above all else is taking over the galaxy, transitioning the Republic into a galactic empire, and placing himself at the top of that. Any and all other concerns come second to that, so if it was a matter between choosing starting the war or pulling Anakin to his side, I think anyone who argues he'd pick the latter is severely overestimating just how badly Palpatine needs Anakin. Like, sure, he wants him as an apprentice, but if he were to die in some random battle during the war, or refuse to give in to the dark side when Palpatine tries to tempt him, it's no massive loss. He can still just as easily wipe out the Jedi with or without Vader leading the assault, I promise you. So that's first and foremost. I don't think Anakin turning to the dark side would ever be prioritized over Sheev becoming Emperor. But also, I don't think there's any reason to think he has to choose one or the other here. People also seem to overestimate Padme's role in Anakin ultimately becoming Vader. Like, yes, it was his motivation to save her from death that caused him to turn to, let's say, alternative sources when the Jedi denied him the rank of Master. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse here. It's strongly implied in Revenge of the Sith that the only reason Anakin was even having those visions of Padme dying was because Palpatine was showing them to him. He was using the connection Anakin had built with Padme to play on his deepest fears, but if Padme wasn't around for that aspect of the plan, he would have just had to resort to other means, of which there are plenty. Anakin is an emotionally stunted and unstable person who, while he always tries his best to be good and do the right thing, has way too much baggage from his childhood to ever truly be able to let go of his attachments. He's constantly being chastised by Obi-Wan, a man he looks up to like a father, for even the smallest mistakes, which causes him to overcorrect and bottle up his thoughts. Palpatine is basically the only person that Anakin feels he can truly confide in, so already I'd say he has a pretty sizable hook in. There is also the matter of Anakin's mother. Assuming Padme were to die at the beginning of Attack of the Clones, if Palpatine ever needed to use someone close to Anakin as motivation to join the Sith, Shmi is right there. I know she dies in this movie, but I don't think Palpatine had any way of knowing that was gonna happen, and if anything, it was kind of a huge coincidence that it did when it did. But even then, I see no reason why Palpatine wouldn't be able to use Shmi's death as a motive going forward. He could easily play on the fact that the Jedi left her there on Tatooine without a second thought because they only actually cared about what Anakin might represent for their order. We've talked about it on the channel before, but the fact that the Jedi never bothered to lift a finger to help the slaves on the far side of the galaxy should be a massive point of contention between them and Anakin. And the death of his mother is only going to amplify that because they could have saved her. I can easily see Palpatine playing on that resentment and subsequently a resentment for the Republic, who the Jedi ultimately answered to and are why they never did anything about slavery, to convince Anakin that things need to fundamentally change. There are a lot of different ways I can see Palpatine playing this without Padme in the picture, and again, even if Padme was somehow the only way to get Anakin to turn to the dark side, I think he'd rather just not have him than lose his chance to create the army. So either way, yeah, it makes sense that he's willing to have her killed. But with that said, the assassination attempt on Padme doesn't make a lick of sense and is one of the funniest things about this entire movie. The first attempt makes enough sense, I think. Zam blows up Padme's ship, but Padme uses a decoy and she dies instead. And an important detail that I want you guys to keep in mind is that the ship bombing was pinned on disgruntled spice miners on Naboo.
Do you have any idea who's behind this attack?
Our intelligence points to disgruntled spice miners on the moons of Naboo.
Which implies that Palpatine and Dooku are intentionally trying to disguise the real culprits behind it. Padme still seems to quickly figure it out, though.
I think that Count Dooku was behind it.
And so this is going to be a running theme throughout the plot assessment, so I'm glad we're getting it out of the way now. A lot of people, myself included, find it a bit confusing that Padme would believe this. As far as the public seems to be aware, Dooku is the leader of a peaceful secessionist movement. All they want is to break away and establish their own government, and if they can do that without having to go to war against the Republic, well then that's just gravy. So why would Dooku, from an official standpoint, his status as a Sith Lord orchestrating the whole war and playing both sides of it from the beginning notwithstanding, want to kill Padme, the most prominent figurehead of the movement to abolish the Military Creation Act? Why would Padme believe that's something he wants to do when her death would essentially ensure war comes to his doorstep? Well, I think if we're being as charitable as we possibly can be to the film, this does actually make sense. It's just that they didn't bother to explain it as well as they should have. Dooku's whole brand is that he's this outspoken activist who's basically stoking the flames of this war in a very passive way. He pretends to not want war, but even in an official capacity, curiosity, many senators like Padme would be able to tell that that's bullshit, and from what little we know about Dooku from these movies, I think that lines up as a reasonable assumption for her to make. Again, I just wish it was explained better, and like I said, I'm glad we found an example of this now, because that's going to be a running trend throughout. So many things about this plot don't make sense, and it's going to be up to us to make what inferences we can. But anyway, I asked you to keep in mind that Dooku seems to prefer if his involvement in Padme's assassination plot is kept a secret, though to what extent, I'm not really sure. And I think that might explain some of the questionable decisions the bounty hunters make when they make their second attempt, but even if we go with that, I still don't think it makes that much sense. So let's lay this out. Zam tells Jango that she hit the ship, but they failed, and so Jango tells her,
"We'll have to try something more subtle this time,"
before handing her a canister with these little centipede things inside of them. And the plan from there is to put the worm canister inside a little droid, send it over to Padme's apartment, have the droid cut a hole in her window, and deposit the worms and just hope they sting her, I guess. There are so many things wrong with this plan, I don't even know where to begin. Like, okay, so before we even get into the specifics, I guess I just want to know what Jango knows about the security detail on Padme right now. Like, surely he knows that there are 2 Jedi Knights guarding her, and Jedi have a reputation of being able to sense living things in the Force, so already sending 2 worms in is just a bad idea, on top of all the obvious reasons why that's dumb that we'll get into. If he doesn't know that there are Jedi guarding her, then I'm already questioning his competence as a bounty hunter, because that just seems like your basic due diligence. You want to know what you're walking into before just sending an operative to go kill a high-ranking, very important person like Padme. But speaking of, let's get a head count of Padme's security detail. Aside from Anakin and Obi-Wan, there's Captain Typho, who's in charge of her Naboo guard, and who apparently doesn't know that Anakin and Padme have decided on this rather ingenious plan to stage Padme in front of a fucking window as bait to lure out the assassins, because otherwise he should be protesting strongly. I know he can't tell Padme what to do, so if she wants to use herself as bait, she's gonna do it, but at the very least you think he'd stay right outside the room where Anakin and Obi-Wan are, right? And obviously it goes without saying he's gonna have men stationed in all the nearby buildings just to make sure there are no snipers in the area. Pretty much any room that has any kind of vantage point on Padme's bedroom is gonna have at least a couple guys in there, right? Well, you'd think that, but if there are any men watching her window from a neighboring skyscraper, they somehow managed to miss the fucking robot flying up right outside her bedroom and importing 2 little worms inside of it. R2 also missed this, apparently. One of the reasons Anakin gave Obi-Wan for why he believed Padme was safe was that the little fucker was in there watching her, but apparently he's on fucking low power mode or some shit. He's vaguely scanning the room, but apparently he's not attentive enough to notice a fucking droid floating outside cutting a hole in her window, so that's interesting. But at least tell me this window is bulletproof or something. Tell me it's several inches thick and can withstand pretty much any means of devastation thrown its way. Of course. You know, Padme, I understand you want to catch these assassins and that you're not comfortable endangering other people in your place. I get that. It's very noble. But maybe when you're the most prominent member of the anti-military movement and you're so close to voting day, maybe it's a bit stupid and reckless to just forfeit your own life like this. It'd be one thing if we knew there was a competent politician who could step in for Padme in the event of her absence, like Bail Organa or Mon Mothma, but we know that's not true, so Padme, you're really playing with fire here.
I haven't worked for a year to defeat the Military Creation Act, to not be here when its fate is decided.
Now, I'm not going to get into detail on whether or not I think it's in character for Anakin or Obi-Wan to go along with a plan as reckless as this until I start talking about the character work. Spoilers, I actually think Obi-Wan is a bit more brash and impulsive than most people seem to think, and some of his hypocrisies are done on purpose by the narrative to highlight a flaw in his character. So, suffice it to say, I actually think on paper, both of them wanting to use Padme as bait is fine, but not with all the reasons we've listed for why this plan is fucking stupid. I don't believe either of them would be willing to take that risk with the lackluster security she's currently working with. But with that said, there are so many ways to go about killing Padme, so let's check back in with the villains. Now again, if I'm a professionally trained bounty hunter, and I've done my homework by scouting this place and seeing what kind of security she's working with, I'm gonna obviously assume it's a trap. Which, of course, it is, but I mean, like, a good one. Like, I don't believe I'm gonna be able to destroy that window without some kind of rocket launcher or something, and I'm certainly not gonna go there myself to do the job, so I'd actually say it's smart to send the droid instead. The droid should be armed with, like, a blaster or some other kind of projectile weapon, and we just do away with the whole worm idea, but otherwise it makes enough sense, right? Even if the plan fails, which it probably will if the heroes are smart, all we've really lost is one piece of hardware that can simply blow itself up if compromised, and which definitely won't lead the Jedi right back to us. So anyway, the droid leads Obi-Wan right to Zam. Even if the assassination had gone off without a hitch, it should have relayed some kind of encrypted message or something to Zam and then self-destructed. There should be no reality where it ever returns to her, especially if there's a fucking person hanging off of it. And Zam, just a bit of advice for you. When you see a Jedi Knight being brought straight toward you, don't shoot the droid he's hanging onto, shoot him. You might think he's not likely to survive that fall, and in fairness, you're probably right. I'd argue it's kind of ridiculous that Obi-Wan did survive it, but I don't see why she would even take the chance. The Jedi are kind of legendary around the galaxy for having magical powers and being able to do all sorts of shit normal people can't, so I think a bullet to the chest is probably the best way to go. Also, I feel like some people are going to try to defend the fact that Obi-Wan survives this with some variation of the Jedi have super durability, which I actually have seen people use when defending moments like this, but in order for stakes to continue to exist in these films, I'm afraid you can't simply establish that Jedi can fall from tremendous heights without so much as a broken bone. So all the times Obi-Wan and Anakin do so during this chase are bullshit as far as I'm concerned, especially when Zam crash lands her speeder, and even if we were accepting that excuse here, that still doesn't apply to Zam, so I guess changelings also have super durability. But okay, so this assassination isn't going well. I don't see why they armed the droid with a pair of fucking worms. I don't know why the droid wasn't programmed to self-destruct once the worms were deposited, or in the event it was compromised. And I don't know why it led the Jedi back to Zam. Like, they literally have it lined up so perfectly. Neither of these people are directly suspected in the assassination attempts in any way, so once Padme is dead, they would get away with it scot-free. Zam is even a shapeshifter, so even if somehow her identity became known to the people investigating the matter, it's very unlikely they'd be able to find her. She's on a planet populated by like 1 trillion people, and she can change her appearance. Speaking of which, why isn't she doing that right now? The Jedi chase her into a nightclub, and she doesn't think to like alter her appearance and try to slip past them. I mean, nothing in the movie establishes she can also transform her clothes, and again, we're not accepting shit that was established in the Clone Wars, so I do not care at all that that's something apparently her species can do. That's fucking stupid, and the shapeshifting also just doesn't look the same as in Attack of the Clones, so I really just don't know what to make of that. So if Anakin got a good look at what she was wearing while chasing her, then maybe that makes it a little harder for her to just slide right past him, but also, she's wearing a jacket and a helmet. You can just abandon those in the bathroom, change into someone completely different looking, and at least fucking try to escape through the front entrance. That's a way better plan than trying to sneak up on Obi-Wan at the bar and fucking kill him. Besides, the only way I would even accept the line of thinking that she can't sneak out is if one or both of the Jedi were guarding the door, but they're not. Obi-Wan goes to the bar because he wants to bait her into attacking him, which she's apparently stupid enough to do, and Anakin goes around searching the crowd for her, so she could easily just slip out. And that's really dumb, because even when chasing a regular perp, you'd obviously want to guard the door. But that's especially true when your quarry is a shapeshifter, which they both know!
I think he is a she, and I think she's a changeling.
I don't understand why none of these characters are making any smart decisions. Okay, let's try this. Maybe the reason Obi-Wan came up with this stupid plan to lure her out was because he didn't think it'd be possible to catch her at the door if she's a shapeshifter. For that, they'd basically have to stop and interrogate everyone trying to exit the building, and they just don't have that kind of manpower. But that doesn't suddenly make this plan of theirs smart, or in any way a better alternative. Zam would have to be really stupid to fall for this bait, especially when they already baited her once and managed to actually catch on to her. And I'm sorry, but from a meta standpoint, I have absolutely no idea why Zam is a shapeshifter. What impact does that have on the narrative? Her very cool and unique ability never affects the story in any way. She doesn't use it to get away from the Jedi, nor do we ever see her use it in her assassination attempts, so why did George write that into the script? So nothing about this assassination attempt makes any sense, nothing about the subsequent chase makes any sense, and to cap it all off, they bring her outside and try to ask her who hired her for the job, but before she can get the words out, she's shot with a Camino saber dart by Jango. Actually, I say before she can get the words out, but she actually does manage to sputter out a few more. It's interesting to me how she was already prepared to sell Jango out, and then he quite literally murdered her to keep her quiet, and she chose in her dying words to curse him, rather than finish telling the Jedi the information she was already about to give them, which would greatly fuck over the guy who just betrayed her. Goodbye, Zam. You died the way you lived, being a fucking idiot. And Jango, What the fuck are you doing, buddy? Why would you shoot Zam with a dart that directly links back to Kamino when you could have gotten the job done just as easily with any regular blaster rifle? Hell, I'd even question why not just hit her with some kind of explosive projectile that might also take out Obi-Wan and Anakin while he's at it. The only way this decision makes any sense is if Jango knows Dooku wants the Jedi to eventually find the clone army on Kamino and is intentionally trying to lure them there. But we actually know that's not true for multiple reasons. A, he was clearly caught off guard later in the film when Obi-Wan did arrive on Kamino and then immediately tries to make a break for Geonosis.
What is it, Dad?
Pack your things. We're leaving.
And I'm inclined to assume this reaction is genuine since Obi-Wan is no longer in the room, and I don't see why he'd be putting on a performance for Boba's sake. And B, that only makes sense if finding Kamino is relatively easy for whatever Jedi is tasked with investigating the origins of this dart. But we know that's not the case because the analysis droids Obi-Wan consults aren't able to figure it out, and he has to go to some guy that he just happens to know working in a diner who happens to just know all sorts of general trivia about the galactic underworld. And some of you are probably saying, well, which is it, Sheev? Is it stupid of Jango to use a dart that can easily be traced back to him, or is it convenient that Obi-Wan just happened to know someone who could tell him where it comes from, which Jango obviously couldn't have accounted for? Well, I mean, why not both? Because first and foremost, if there's even a remote chance the Jedi might be able to find Kamino using the dart, then that's a very good reason not to use it when you have other weapons at your disposal. And it's just common sense to reduce the percentage to 0. But also, when I say it's convenient that Obi-Wan just happens to know a guy who has the exact obscure information he needs to push his investigation forward, I want to be clear that I have no problem believing the Jedi would have figured it out eventually. If not Obi-Wan, there'd surely be some other Jedi with criminal connections, and one of those connections is bound to have something useful to offer. It's mainly a matter of timing. An investigation that could have easily lasted several months or even years is instead being resolved within a calendar day because Obi-Wan, by sheer coincidence, is buddies with a guy who spent some time prospecting in a place near Kamino, a world that's far away from anything and everything in the galaxy and is by necessity very obscure. So if Jango wanted the Jedi to use the dart to find them, then I hope he was prepared to wait several months for that to pan out. Hell, maybe that's why he was so surprised when Obi-Wan turned up when he did. But I think this is kind of a moot point anyway, because not only do I just not believe Jango was in the know about the plan any further than he needs to be, which is something we're gonna get into later, but it's also completely unnecessary as a move. If Palpatine and Dooku want the Jedi to find Kamino, they can easily just have the Kaminoans reach out to them directly. They are making an army for the Republic and haven't heard from them in 10 years. It's easy enough to just have them call the Chancellor's office and be like, hey, is this still happening? Your army's ready. Although I guess that also raises the question of if the Kaminoans are in on the plan and to what extent, but I don't actually know if it changes much of the plot either way if they do, so I'm not trying to get into that right now. For the time being, I'd like to keep on this line of thinking about how the villains expect the heroes to learn the information necessary for the war to begin in the time frame that they need to for everything to play out the way Palpatine wants. Like I already said, I think it makes enough sense that they can just have the Kaminoans reach out to the Republic, and that can be how the army is discovered. But another thing that's worth considering is, how are the Jedi meant to learn about the droid factory, and the fact that several commercial and political figures are gathering on Geonosis to discuss terms with Count Dooku? That needs to happen to push the senators over the edge and force them to vote in favor of granting Palpatine emergency wartime powers and pass the military creation bill. So how do the Sith hope to have that happen? Well, I suppose the simplest way to facilitate that would be to simply have the Jedi investigate Dooku for the assassination attempts on Padme. I mean, again, she already accused him, so whether or not she actually dies, that would make him a suspect and give the Jedi cause to look into his activities. Palpatine might be able to slip them a lead that he's on Geonosis, the same way he helps them find Grievous on Utapau in Episode 3.
Palpatine thinks General Grievous is on Utapau. A partial message was intercepted in a diplomatic packet from the chairman of Utapau.
And then that can be how they find out about the army. I suppose if we're going with that, then that's yet another knock against the theory that Dooku was trying to assassinate Padme without incriminating himself, so yeah, those worms really just don't make any sense. As it stands in the movie, though, what happens is Obi-Wan finds Kamino thanks to a mix of Jango's stupidity and massive convenience that Obi-Wan knows a guy who can point him in the right direction. And from there, he manages to land a tracker on Jango's ship before he can make it off the landing platform. And he only manages to do that because he somehow survives a bunch of bullshit that shouldn't have been possible during their fight. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, I think it makes enough sense that Palpatine would probably have had ways of getting the Jedi where they needed to go regardless of how things played play out, but it's still interesting to me that through sheer happenstance, Obi-Wan continues to just luck his way through the plot in ways that fit perfectly within Palpatine's timeline. It just makes him seem like less of a conniving genius and more like his plans only work because fate seems to have willed it so.
It was the will of the Force.
Fuck off! Also, I'd like to believe Obi-Wan discovering the army was enough to cause mass hysteria in the Senate and cause them to vote in favor of the army. Otherwise, a good deal of Palpatine's plan suddenly rests on Jar Jar swaying the undecided voters, and I don't know how to feel about that. I don't understand why Padme's even chosen Jar Jar as a representative in the first place. Like, I get that he's her friend and he helped save the day in the last movie. I also get that following the peace between the Naboo and the Gungans, having a Gungan representative in your cabinet is a smart move. But Jar Jar isn't a politician, and he's not particularly smart. I don't see why she would ever trust him with anything under normal circumstances, let alone on something this important. The fact that he was appointed to this position gave him the authority to speak to the Senate with what was essentially Padme's voice. Yeah, he was saying things that she would never have wanted, which makes him a bad representative. This is all your fault, Padme. You should have known better.
You've got to do better, Senator.
So now I think we should get into the whole clone conspiracy, because that's the backbone of the entire plot, and it doesn't make any sense. This is going to be the most difficult one to unravel, I think, because it's so confusing and convoluted that it's really hard to tell what any of the characters actually know by the end. It's especially hard for the audience to try to keep track of it all, and I'm speaking as someone who's watched this movie countless times over the last 22 years, and still has trouble working it all out. Starting from the beginning, after the rather embarrassing attempts at assassinating Padme, Obi-Wan is assigned to conduct an investigation on the matter while Anakin takes her into hiding and chills out on Naboo. One of the first things Obi-Wan discovers once Dexter tells him about Kamino is that Kamino doesn't exist anywhere in Jedi record, despite their maps showing indications of a surrounding gravitational pull where the planet ought to be, and this leads him and Yoda to conclude that it was erased by a fellow Jedi. Now, of course, Dooku was a Jedi, as this film establishes many times, so I suppose that could lead them to the conclusion that he was the one who did it, and we're gonna get into what evidence the Jedi might have to suspect Dooku of commissioning the clones later, but I suppose it's just as easily likely they assume Sifo Dyas did it. I mean, we know Sifo Dyas was a real Jedi who existed and has been presumed dead for the last 10 years because Obi-Wan acknowledges him by name.
I'm sorry, Master...
Jedi Master Sifo Dyas is still a leading member of the Jedi Council, is he not?
Master Sifo Dyas was killed almost 10 years ago.
And this isn't just him putting on an act for the Kaminoans, like when he feigns knowledge about the army, because he does the same thing with Yoda and Windu later, and they also acknowledge him.
They say Master Sifo Dyas placed an order for a clone army at the request of the Senate almost 10 years ago. I was under the impression he was killed before that.
Interesting, by the way, that Obi-Wan worded it that way. It suggests Sifo Dyas was killed, but the films tell us nothing more about the nature of his death, and it's all shrouded in vagaries. Anyway, Obi-Wan then goes to Kamino and is shocked to discover that they were expecting him, having apparently spent the last 10 years working on an army for the Republic that was ordered by a Jedi Council member.
Please tell your master, Sifo Dyas, that his order will be met on time.
After being given a tour of the facility and seeing the clones for himself, Obi-Wan gets introduced to Jango Fett and learns quite a few interesting things. First of all, he confirms without question that Jango is indeed the bounty hunter who hired Zam for the assassination job, because Jango didn't bother hiding his armor at all, and since he didn't decide to kill Obi-Wan and Anakin along with Zam, they were both able to see him taking off in it after killing her. Nice one, Jango. The other thing Obi-Wan learns when he asks him if he's met Sifo Dyas is that Jango was recruited for the job by a man called Tyrannus on one of the moons of Bogdan, which we later discover is the Sith name for Count Dooku.
I was recruited by a man called Tyrannus on one of the moons of Bogdan.
Welcome home, Lord Tyrannus.
But of course, Obi-Wan has no way of knowing that, and would most likely assume Tyrannus is the code name of Sifo Dyas, since he'd ordered the army without the permission of the Jedi, as Obi-Wan later learns when conferring with Mason Yoda. They order him to take Jango in so they can interrogate him at the Jedi Temple, but he catches Jango as he's hastily trying to get out, they fight, and the bounty hunter escapes. In a last-ditch effort, Obi-Wan lands a tracking beacon on the Slave One and follows it to Geonosis, where he discovers Dooku and the Separatists gathering, along with the droid army. From there, Obi-Wan manages to get a message to Anakin and the rest of the Jedi about what he's discovered before being captured, and in the conversation he has with Dooku, he learns this.
What if I told you that the Republic was now under the control of the Dark Lord of the Sith? Hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation was once in league with this Darth Sidious, but he was betrayed 10 years ago by the Dark Lord.
There's a lot to unpack with all this, but now that it's all laid out, let's review what the Jedi know by the end of the film. I suppose the biggest thing that a lot of people tend to note is the fact that Jango Fett is now confirmed to be linked to the assassination attempts on Padme, the Clone Army, and Count Dooku. So that's a bit of an immediate red flag that the Jedi really should have picked up on, huh? I'm not saying Jango working for Dooku is of itself a dead giveaway. He is, after all, a bounty hunter, and his allegiance isn't really to any one faction. Just because he's working for Dooku here doesn't necessarily mean Dooku has any connection to the clones, right? But it's really the convenient timing of it all that you'd think would raise a few eyebrows. I mean, okay, Padme is the leader of the movement to stop the creation of the Clone Army, and she's just named Dooku as the one behind her assassination attempts. Her reason seeming to be that he wants this war to start, and the only way that happens is if the Senate votes to greenlight the army. And wouldn't you know it, the very same bounty hunter hired for this job is also being employed by the Kaminoans to create said army for the Republic, right when they're about to need one. And if there was any doubt before that Jango was working on behalf of Dooku to kill Padme, the fact that he flees right to Geonosis when Obi-Wan finds him and is then seen working for Dooku at the arena, I mean, that's kind of the nail on the coffin, right? Well, I suppose that does, to an extent, come down to what the Jedi believe about Dooku by the end of the film as well, doesn't it? This plays into a larger discussion that I want to get into, actually, and I guess now's the perfect time to do it. Just a bit ago, I played the clip of Dooku laying out to Obi-Wan basically everything he could ever hope to know about the Sith and what they're doing. He tells him about the name Darth Sidious, he tells him about the fact that he was working with Newt Gunray during the Naboo crisis, and he tells him that the Dark Lord is currently in control of the entire Galactic Republic. Many are quick to criticize this scene because, I mean, yeah, why would Dooku tell a Jedi Knight all that sensitive information? Sure, maybe he really does want Obi-Wan to join his cause, but if Obi-Wan goes over to his side on the basis that he wants to destroy the Sith only to find out Dooku is working for the Sith, then how exactly does he expect that to go? Well, I think the obvious answer to this is that Dooku doesn't really expect Obi-Wan to join him, but even if he does, he's obviously not going to tell him that he actually serves the Sith, which then begs the question, do the Jedi know Count Dooku is a Sith? You might be saying, well, of course they do. They say as much in Revenge of the Sith.
Get help, you're no match for him. He's a Sith Lord.
Chancellor Palpatine, Sith Lords are our speciality.
And the Clone Wars makes it out as though his status as a Sith Lord is common knowledge. Even Dooku admits it in front of Anakin.
The Sith control everything.
But hold on there, Jimbo. Let's think about this for a moment. Just based on Attack of the Clones, I don't want you to factor any other source of information here. Do the Jedi have enough reason to conclude that? Having a red lightsaber doesn't automatically make you a Sith, nor does having Force lightning. And I know some of you might try to counter that this level of nuance wasn't really a factor when George was writing these movies, and that I'm using information from established lore after the fact to come to that conclusion, but I don't think I am. Why would George have Dooku tell him all that unless he had it in mind that Dooku using a red lightsaber and throwing around Force lightning didn't necessarily mean anything in the eyes of the Jedi, beyond that he's given into the dark side, which isn't the same thing as being a Sith. So that's the interesting thing. I think Dooku telling him this should have theoretically had the exact desired effect. Obi-Wan might or might not believe this himself, but he's still going to go back and report this to the Council, provided he survives his execution, and then at that point this information is out there. He's managed to create a divide between the Jedi and the Senate, because if there's even a small chance that Dooku was telling the truth, that puts into question everything the Jedi believe about the government to which they're sworn to protect. If an evil so terrible as the Sith were able to get into the very heart of the Republic and take control of its festering corruption, then is it a Republic deserving of saving? Naturally from this, there'd be a lot of Jedi thinking along these lines who might second guess their role in the war. Many would choose to sit it out, many would defect to Dooku's side, many might even stay with the Republic for the sole purpose of sabotaging the war effort for the Separatists. There's any number of possibilities. And keep in mind that Dooku is a former Jedi Master himself, who has the respect and admiration of many of his colleagues, even those in the highest ranks of the Order.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
You know, milady, Count Dooku was once a Jedi. He couldn't assassinate anyone. It's not in his character.
This isn't just some random guy saying all this to make the Republic look bad. This is a man who spent decades of his life fighting for the common good, basically declaring that he wants to save the galaxy from their ancient enemy. Of course a lot of the Jedi are going to listen to him, and from that comes a natural divide in the Order. You might say I'm pulling all this out of my ass, but at the end of the film, Obi-Wan, Windu, and Yoda all discuss it, and while Yoda is quick to dismiss Dooku's words as lies meant to sow division, Windu at least keeps an open mind about it and says they should keep a closer eye on the Senate. Senate, which is something that obviously gets carried through in the next film. So I definitely think that was the intention of the writer. I guess the problem is, Lucas just decided not to go through with it when writing episode 3, and for the life of me, I seriously can't figure out why. At first I thought it was a matter of time management. Revenge of the Sith is a big movie with a lot of ground to cover, so it makes sense you'd want to kill Dooku off early so you can start setting the stage for Palpatine's rise to power and the birth of Darth Vader. But then I remembered General Grievous exists. The character was invented for Revenge of the Sith. And yes, I know technically he first appeared in the Clone Wars cartoon in 2003. You're all very knowledgeable. Thank you for your comments. But the only reason he was even put into that show was because George was planning for him to have a major role in the third film. He'd conceptualized a domineering alien cyborg to serve as the leader of the droid army. And in Revenge of the Sith, he's treated as basically the big bad of the Separatists after Dooku dies. Like, oh man, if only we could just catch Grievous, then we could end the war. Cut off the head and the snake dies, that sort of thing. Which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense considering Grievous is just an army general. Like, sure, he's the leader of the whole army, but he's not any kind of politician. Surely there's other Separatist figureheads who would outrank him in the event of Dooku's death, right? Well, either way, I think my solution to this, so that you can give Dooku a bigger role, is to just cut Grievous from the film entirely. That way you can take the time to develop these concepts I just went over while saving time and being efficient with how many characters you use. And, I don't know, save Grievous for one of the animated shows or something. But a potential hurdle to this solution is that Dooku's death being at the beginning of the movie serves the narrative in two ways that you really can't do without. Firstly, it showcases how much more powerful Obi-Wan and especially Anakin have become in the years since Attack of the Clones. Where in the last movie he handed them both of their asses, in this one Anakin beats Dooku almost casually. And secondly, you really do need this moment to show just how deeply Anakin has fallen already so that his full transition later into the dark side is more believable. You need to show us just how much sway Palpatine's words have over him and how willing he is to just straight up execute an unarmed prisoner, and trying to move that to anywhere later in the movie doesn't really work. Especially if he's taking over Grievous's role, because the whole point of that is to get Obi-Wan off Coruscant so that Anakin is all alone and easy for Palpatine to get his hooks in. So at that point, you can't really have the payoff of him killing Dooku, can you? But I think I have a workaround. Introduce a new character. Oh, hi, Ventress! This would actually work to fix a few things. Let me cook. If Ventress were to be introduced in episode 2, which, by the way, it's well documented that concepts for her were already being drawn up as a potential Sith character before they eventually settled on Dooku, so I don't want to hear anyone say I'm arguing from hindsight here. If they were to introduce Ventress here, then you could just have her be the one who rinses Obi-Wan and cuts off Anakin's arm. Then she could be the one who they fight when rescuing the Chancellor, and could be the one Anakin beheads, while Dooku ends up getting away and fleeing to Utapau. I even think you could still have Anakin be the one to kill Dooku in this version. They would just have to change up the Utapau fight a little bit, but even then, I think this also serves to bolster the themes. In episode 3, Anakin wants to go on the mission to catch Grievous, but the Jedi Council don't want him to go because they don't trust him, and they want him to spy on the Chancellor, so Obi-Wan goes instead. If Obi-Wan were to have failed the assignment, however, then that would only add to Anakin's increasing frustrations that the Jedi are holding him back and underestimating his talents. And then, while you're playing into that, you have Dooku get away with the rest of the Separatist leaders to Mustafar. With Dooku still alive, that means the war technically isn't over, and that, coupled with the fact that this version of the story also has a lot of Jedi defecting or abstaining from the war, is going to make it a much easier sell for Palpatine to declare the Jedi as traitors and argue that they need to transition into a more secure power base in order to ensure security and stability for all. Then, when Anakin gets sent to Mustafar to wipe out the remaining Separatists, that can be when he faces off against Dooku, and they could end it with a direct parallel to the Luke and Vader fight in Return of the Jedi, where this time it's Anakin standing over a crippled Dooku, but unlike Luke, he doesn't hesitate to finish the job. I think this is a scene that could work, provided Dooku doesn't understand that Anakin is doing this on behalf of Sidious and just assumes he's still a Jedi, because otherwise I guess you could argue that he should have pointed out to Anakin that Palpatine is ultimately going to betray him too, but then again, that problem exists in the actual movie anyway, so whatever. I understand I'm getting a bit carried away with this rewrite, and I do apologize for that, but it's worth getting into because this is all stuff that Attack of the Clones would have had to lay the groundwork for so that it could be properly paid off in Revenge of the Sith. And like I said, there are other things I think introducing Ventress would accomplish that are more directly centered around episode 2. For one thing, you could rework it so that Ventress is the one in charge of the assassination attempts on Padme, and you basically just combine Jango and Zam into one character. And don't make him Jango Fett. We don't need an origin story for Boba. It completely takes away from the mystery of his character and makes the universe feel so much smaller. In this version of the story, Jango is still the bounty hunter hired for the clone army, and he's the one that ends up being chased by Anakin and Obi-Wan after the assassination attempt fails. Then, like Zam, he gets killed by Ventress before he can give any information to the Jedi, and that gets rid of the stupidity of him shooting Zam with the Kamino saber dart and leading the Jedi right to him. The Jedi could just find them on his body and use them to trace back to Kamino, and the plot stays the exact same. All you need from there is for Obi-Wan to go from Kamino to Geonosis, but that's easy enough. Just have Ventress follow Obi-Wan to Kamino, thinking he's leading her to Padme, and then when she realizes where she actually is, have them get in a fight, she escapes, and he puts the tracker on her ship, just like with Jango. This fixes so many problems because now there's no link at all between the clones and Dooku from the Jedi's perspectives. Obi-Wan wouldn't have any reason to assume Ventress was on Kamino for any reason other than that she was following him. It allows the parts of the plot that make sense to remain relatively the same, and it introduces a shit ton of new things that add to the overall narrative and bolster what George was clearly going for with these movies.
It's big thighs.
Okay, we'll try some of that.
Huge thighs.
We got our
Hermit thighs.
I've always said the prequels have a lot of good ideas in them, and all they really needed were a couple more redrafts, and for George to have a few other people to bounce his ideas off of. Everything I've just laid out for you, Jolly and I came up with after just a couple hours of brainstorming. But unfortunately, one of George's biggest flaws that seriously serve as a detriment to these films is his belief that he has to do everything himself, and he should be the only one with any kind of creative control. But art is by nature a collaborative effort, and if you try to go at it alone, you're inevitably going to trip over yourself. But anyway, that's enough about hypotheticals and rewrites. The reason I felt this was all worth going over is that if the Jedi do know Dooku is a Sith, then that makes everything so much worse, because as I'm about to go over, the Jedi have to be really stupid to not figure out Dooku had a hand in the creation of the clones, and if he's a Sith Lord, then, well, connect the dots. Now, we went over already how some of the things Dooku did might be easily explained as the work of Sifo Dyas, as far as the Jedi are aware. Stuff like erasing Kamino from the archives, ordering the army, and maybe even using the name Tyrannus when recruiting Jango. But there are certain things that Sifo Dyas couldn't possibly have done, or at least not alone. And I think the biggest one here is, who paid for this army, exactly? Sifo Dyas was a Jedi Council member. He wasn't some wealthy politician or some kind of multi-trillionaire CEO of a massive corporation, which he would basically have to be for the kind of funding it takes to produce an army of clones. And it's not like he could have stolen that money from the Jedi Treasury or somehow from the Republic either, because, again, that amount of money isn't just going to get moved without someone noticing. This implies that Sifo Dyas must have had some mysterious third party serving as a benefactor. Maybe this Tyrannus, or maybe someone else entirely. And, well, Dooku has that kind of money, and at the very least, Padme was already set on the notion that he's secretly trying to get this war started. Sure, the Jedi don't initially believe her, but by the end of the film, they're obviously going to be singing a different tune. But that on its own isn't enough, I think. It's one thing for Dooku to want the Republic to greenlight an army so that he can make the plausible defense that going to war against them is an act of self-defense, and another entirely to want them to just have one ready to go at a moment's notice once the war has begun. The only way that makes any sense is if he created the army and is therefore secretly in control of it, and suddenly his connection to Jango and Jango's connection to Padme's assassination attempts are lining up a little too well. So it's already a bit weird that the Jedi don't piece that together. The senator most prominently advocating against forming an army is suddenly the subject of multiple assassination attempts by a man who's associated both with the leader of the opposition, who secretly wants the war to start, and with the people currently working on the dubiously funded army that are set to conveniently be unveiled right around the time the bill is pushed. But if the Jedi know Dooku is a Sith, then that adds even more context to all this. That confirms for them that the Sith are behind the whole war and are not so secretly in control of both armies fighting in it, with the Jedi right in the thick of it all. The characters have all these pieces right in front of them that are practically already in place, and they never figure any of it out, because even they got confused by the plot of this movie. This is what I mean when I say the clone conspiracy plot doesn't make any sense and that it's hard to figure out what the characters do and don't know by the end. Because the answers are really obvious, and these characters are supposed to have at least average levels of intelligence. People always like to say I'm arguing from hindsight, or that because I have access to information that the characters don't, that makes it unfair of me to act like I know better than them. But I kinda just don't buy that. We're just audience members. We might be invested in the story, but ultimately there are no stakes to our personal lives if things go badly for the characters. At the end, the credits will roll, the lights will come up, and we can all go home and forget about what we just watched. But the characters in the movie don't have that luxury. They're in it. They have have to actually spend time thinking about all the things they learn in the story. And I'm sorry, if the Jedi actually did seriously contemplate all the information they had at their disposal, they should have figured it out. They just should have. But there's a lot more to talk about with this movie, and I don't want to spend all day talking about the clone conspiracy, so let's not waste any more time. While Obi-Wan is off doing all that, Anakin has been assigned to protect Padme. And something I feel is worth noting is how the Jedi Council go about making the decision to assign Anakin to this task. In my Clone Wars video, I mentioned how the Council were always hesitant to trust Anakin, and so I thought it was a bit weird how they were so quick to promote him to the rank of Jedi Knight so shortly after Attack of the Clones, even with a war on and them being desperate, but I was actually misremembering. It's a commonly cited thing with the prequels how the Jedi, namely personified by Mace Windu, don't really trust Anakin.
I don't trust him.
See? But actually, in Episode 2, it's really only Obi-Wan who casts doubts about Anakin. The rest of the Jedi are perfectly happy to see him actually progress and do his thing.
I am concerned for my Padawan. He is not ready to be given this assignment on his own yet.
The Council is confident in its decision, Obi-Wan.
The boy has exceptional skills.
Now, from a character perspective, I actually think it makes sense that Obi-Wan feels this way. He was still a Padawan himself when Qui-Gon found Anakin and only barely ready to become a Jedi Knight, let alone take on his own Padawan, and especially one as important as this one. So, as a result, he sort of overcorrected and kept Anakin on a leash that's way too short. Every conversation inevitably becomes a stern lecture. Every little mistake Anakin makes gets him chastised. Obi-Wan is trying to act like what he thinks a Jedi Master ought to act like, but he doesn't really know what that means because his own master often went against the grain, and Obi-Wan never really had a chance to figure it out for himself before having an apprentice thrust upon him unexpectedly. This has led to a strained and frustrated dynamic between the two, especially on Anakin's part, since all he's ever done is try to live up to Obi-Wan's example, and it never seems to be enough. You get the distinct impression that Anakin doesn't normally do things like talk back to Obi-Wan, which is why when he actually does in front of Padme, Obi-Wan seems genuinely surprised.
And you will pay attention to my lead.
Why?
What?
And this tells us that the sort of bratty, childish behavior we see from Anakin is a relatively new thing that he's letting out. Partially to try to impress Padme, but partially because he feels like he finally has the freedom to do so. And something I feel a lot of people misunderstand about this movie is Obi-Wan's character. Because yes, he does often chastise Anakin for being brash or impulsive, but then he'll turn around and do the same kind of thing.
If you'll excuse me.
I hate it when he does that.
I've seen so many people point out this hypocrisy as a mark against the film when, like, no, that's the point. Even in the scene where he's telling Yoda and Windu that he doesn't think Anakin is ready for this assignment, Yoda passive-aggressively points out how Obi-Wan isn't as different from Anakin as he likes to pretend.
His abilities have made him, well, arrogant.
A flaw more and more common among Jedi. Too sure of themselves they are. Even the older, more experienced ones.
This is absolutely intentional on George's part, and it's in line with the OT.
You are reckless.
So was I, if you remember.
This is why I actually think it makes sense that Obi-Wan is willing to use Padme as bait to catch the assassins, even though he'd never admit it. He voices his protest to the plan, but I don't see him putting a stop to it. The plan is still stupid, though. That part Obi-Wan should not have been cool with. But anyway, from the perspective of the Jedi Council, Anakin is basically an honor student. I mean, again, he's basically that way by necessity, because he's so starved for actual praise and recognition by his master, and he never gets any. The best he can get is a sort of backhanded compliment that serves to belittle him as much as praise him.
Aim right above the fuel cells. Good call, my young Padawan.
You can tell just by the change in Anakin's expression here that the use of the word young really gets to him.
We will not exceed our mandate, my young Padawan learner.
Only in your mind, my very young apprentice.
So yeah, I actually think it makes sense that the Council are willing to trust Anakin with this assignment, because as they see it, he's a good dude who Obi-Wan is only restricting at this point. Plus, they still seem to believe he's the chosen one.
Remember, Obi-Wan, if the prophecy is true, your apprentice is the only one who can bring the Force back into balance.
I suppose if anything, I'd like to know more about what exactly changed in those 3 years between films that got Windu to completely flip his position on the subject. But then again, it's probably mainly to do with how close he's become with the Chancellor, who they've also grown to not trust. But now for my criticism of this. They're right to think Obi-Wan is holding Anakin back and that he just needs to put a little trust in him, but Obi-Wan also has very good reason to be concerned about this move. Anakin was just telling Obi-Wan last night about how much being around Padme is messing with him.
Just being around her again is intoxicating.
He knows Anakin has long since struggled with attachments in his past, and that was one of the major reasons the Jedi didn't want to train him initially. And Padme is a significant figure of affection from Anakin's life that he most certainly does not need to be tempted by. If Obi-Wan raised this objection to the Council and they decided to give Anakin the assignment anyway as a test to see how he would fare under these conditions, I'd be fine with that. But the problem is, Obi-Wan never does. The reasons he gives the Jedi for why he doesn't think Anakin is ready are unhelpfully vague and make it easier for Yoda and Windu to dismiss him as being overbearing. Also, for those of you who are about to bring it up in the comments, I know he actually does mention it in a deleted scene.
Master, we should not have been given this assignment. I fear Anakin will not be able to protect the Senator. He has an emotional connection with her. It's been there since he was a boy. Now he's confused, distracted.
But I consider deleted scenes to be dubiously canon at best, especially considering this one has the characters repeat lines from the other scene.
I'm concerned for my Padawan. He is not ready to be on his own.
If the prophecy is true, he is the one who will bring balance to the Force.
So unless Obi-Wan and Windu are just trying to one-up each other in redundancy, I'm inclined to believe this didn't happen. But either way, they send Anakin on the mission, and that's where the B-plot kicks in. The notorious romance between Anakin and Padme that this movie tries to build up, which will become integral to the overarching storyline of Darth Vader's entire character. There are multiple times in the behind-the-scenes where they refer to this movie as a love story.
This one, it's a much more condensed love story.
Episode 2 is George's first real romance movie. It's this love story between Anakin Skywalker and Senator Amidala.
And even though it's primarily a mystery and a love story.
So in many ways, this plotline is the centerpiece of the whole film, if not the entire trilogy. And it's very bad. And okay, I can already hear it being shouted at me before I even begin to make the point, so let's address this. A lot of the criticisms toward these scenes stem from the fact that the dialogue is rather cringe.
Believe me, I wish that I could just wish away my feelings.
My goodness, you've grown.
So have you. Grown more beautiful, I mean. Well, for a senator, I mean.
Please don't look at me like that.
Why not?
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Sorry, milady.
And Anakin has absolutely zero riz.
I don't like sand.
Hey, you guys knew I was going to play that clip at some point in this video. It's obligatory. And I don't even disagree with that assessment. I just don't think it goes deep enough. But prequel fans are often quick to counter that, of course Anakin is bad at flirting. He's been cooped up in a temple with an order of celibate warrior monks since he was 10 years old and had a very stunted upbringing. He hasn't had a chance to practice his social skills in like a decade, and the fact that he's been actively told by the Jedi not to go around falling in love hasn't exactly lent itself to an ability to talk to women. And yeah, that is actually fair. I agree with that point. I think the problem is more with Padme and the way she reciprocates these advances. She did similarly have a less than orthodox childhood, and so she probably doesn't have the best social skills, though surely far better than Anakin's considering her station and experience in diplomacy. But the thing is, this movie is kind of starting off at a disadvantage in terms of the way Padme views Anakin, and so it's having to fight an uphill battle in order to make this relationship even slightly believable.
And he'll always be that little boy I knew on Tatooine.
These characters met when they were both still kids, but Padme was already a fair bit older than Anakin, and obviously one would hope any sort of romantic affection was the last thing that was ever on her mind anytime she interacted with him as a little boy. They seem to get along fairly well, and considering what a dark place she was in at the time, with her planet being under a tyrannical blockade and her people suffering, I'm sure his presence was something of a shining light for her that she remembers fondly years later. But now that they're reunited, she kind of has to mentally separate that little boy she knew with the young man she now sees before her, which is kind of difficult to do already without all his constant whining and the very creepy things he says to her.
You're exactly the way I remember you in my dreams.
Padme as a character is someone who prioritizes her career and the people she can help with it above any personal interests or desires. Not to mention that their respective commitments restrict her from being with this person specifically. So there has to be something about Anakin that's enticing enough to make her fall in love with him despite all those factors, beyond just the fact that he's hot. And unfortunately, they never really develop that attraction. She just kind of falls for him despite herself, even though he's not charming, he's not particularly likable, and he can't flirt for shit. I mentioned this in the last video, but a simple rewrite to The Phantom Menace that would have helped this significantly would have been if Anakin was just a bit older when the Jedi found him on Tatooine. If he'd been around the same age as Padme when they met, then not only could he have been a source of joy for her at a time when things were so dire, but they could have also developed that attraction in the first one, and then the second movie would benefit from being able to build off of what was already there. But if we're taking The Phantom Menace as is, and we're not allowed to change it, then I still think there are ways to make this relationship believable. It's possible, but it seems like George was striving for the exact opposite in every single scene. Again, people like to shit on the dialogue, and that's fair, but the dialogue is terrible throughout this movie.
How many ways are there for me to say, shut the fuck up?
It's the way this cringy dialogue is used that specifically damages any chance of a sane human woman ever finding him desirable. Like, sorry Anakin, I'm sure you're a swell guy, and I know you guys got along well when you were kids, but you barely know each other. Let's be realistic. You've been reunited for a couple of days, and you're already pouring your entire soul into his speech about how you're obsessed with her and that her very presence is tormenting you. I don't think a scene like this would work even if the movie had done a good job setting it up beforehand, but it especially doesn't feel earned when the only things we've gotten up until this point is a really awkwardly timed kiss and a picnic in a field where Anakin advocates for fascism.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Well, if it works.
It was extremely romantic.
But the thing is, even if their chemistry was convincing, that really wouldn't matter because of, well, this scene. So they go to Tatooine after another especially brutal nightmare about his mother, find the Lars homestead, Anakin rides off to find her, and she dies in his arms at the Tusken Raider camp. For the record, I think everything about this moment is really good. Probably the best scene in the whole movie. The acting is on point, the sort of chaotic energy to the music really sells Anakin's instability as he finally takes his first steps into darkness. Everything about it just works. Except for the part where he tells Padme.
To be angry is to be human.
Oh boy. So Padme's whole deal throughout both these movies so far has been that she cares deeply about people, especially the innocent. Pretty much every action she's taken her whole life has been in service of helping as many people as she can, with no regard for her own personal happiness. The films constantly go out of their way to reinforce to us that she's a good person and that the suffering of others is something that weighs heavily on her. I mean, even the whole body double thing. She's willing to play along with the charade, but when it's clear there's actual danger present, she's deeply impacted by the fact that someone died for her and isn't willing to let that happen again, so she uses herself as bait. So her saying this to Anakin after he just confessed to the massacre of innocent women and children is a choice, to be sure, but this could work if it was just rewritten so that Padme had a sort of dark side. Like, let's say Padme was someone who theoretically does want to help people however she can, but that the constant pressures of always having to put others before herself since she was a child have slowly gotten to her and made her weary of it all. If the films ever characterized her as someone who has selfish and destructive tendencies that Anakin sort of brings out in her, which would be helped greatly by a version of their romance where he was actually charming and attractive, that would be one thing. I wouldn't have nearly as big a problem with this if it was framed so that her accepting what Anakin did was an indictment on her character. Then from there, you would build a sort of toxic and possessive relationship where both of them actively bring out the worst in each other, despite how much they might care for one another, a la Jimmy and Kim. But as it stands, Padme is basically presented throughout all these movies as this paragon of virtue. She is the example of what it means to be good and do the right thing no matter what, and her relationship with Anakin isn't even really depicted as anything particularly toxic until he, it actually does turn to the dark side fully. Although considering Padme was cool with the Tusken slaughter, I'm not really sure why she's drawing the line at him killing younglings. Maybe if this new version of Padme was characterized to buy into the whole Tuskens aren't people narrative that the Lars family were talking about, then you could maybe work around that, but again, that's gonna require turning her into a more selfish and somewhat narrow-minded character. Honestly though, my preferred reworking of the scene would simply be that Anakin doesn't tell her at all. That way you don't have to compromise on her main character trait, plus you actually have some added bonuses. For one, I think the only person Anakin should have confided in about this is Palpatine.
Remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand people?
This would signify just how much Anakin trusts Palpatine to the point where he's comfortable confessing his greatest sin to him, but not to the Jedi or Obi-Wan, not even to Padme, the love of his life. Then throughout the rest of the story, even if they are in love, it's never exactly true, is it? Anakin hasn't told her everything about himself because he knows if she knew the truth, she would be disgusted by him, and then that can play into his insecurities and only drive him further into Palpatine's arms. But that's not what they did, so as it stands, yikes, Padme. What the fuck? Like, I wonder how frustrated Django's gonna be when he finds out George just did his job for him.
I slaughtered them.
It was extremely romantic.
And just because I feel like it's kind of the obvious thing to do here, let's compare this romance plot to that of Han and Leia from The Empire Strikes Back. The two actually have chemistry going into the film because A New Hope bothered setting it up. Their back and forth is a more argumentative, confrontational one, and that stays consistent throughout the trilogy. It's their love language, and it's based on who they are as people, so the dialogue always feels natural and bolsters the romantic connection. But like I said, it also helps tremendously that there was a clear attempt from the outset to actually develop them as a potential couple, with Lucas playing around with the love triangle between them and Luke.
You think a princess and a guy like me?
No.
Part of this scene was really just Han messing with Luke, but it still works as a setup for that ultimate eventuality. And obviously, once it was retconned so that Luke and Leia were long-lost siblings, there really wasn't much of a contest for who was going to end up with who, but that only worked because the last film did such a good job making their relationship believable. Unlike with Padme, it actually feels within character for Leia to go for a guy like Han, despite everything she's ever believed about herself telling her that he's wrong for her. Having been raised as a princess, she naturally would have been brought up to expect a husband of regal stature, probably in some kind of arrangement made by her father, but that's not exactly how her life turned out, is it? Now she has no kingdom and is barely getting by with the clothes on her back, and that opens up a whole new world for her of interesting characters she might have otherwise never met, or at least never looked at twice. So no, Han is absolutely not an ideal match for her, and yet she finds him exciting and dangerous, while also recognizing that he has compassion. Unlike with Padme and Anakin, there are no external factors telling her they can't be together, and internally she has every reason to want him. Now, of course, these relationships aren't exactly comparable, because at least Han is an actual good person who hasn't massacred any indigenous villages that we know of. But the only thing I can really say to that is maybe if you want a woman to fall in love with a guy, don't have that guy do something so monstrous that every principled bone in her body should be telling her to run in the opposite direction. Again, you could have reworked this film to either have Padme never find out about the Tusken Massacre, or tweaked her character so that her being willing to overlook it actually makes sense. But it's all about what you're working with here. Because Leia is the type of person who would never accept Han if she found out he did something like that, they just decided not to have Han ever do something like that. See? Problem solved. Han is also just naturally charming, and the dialogue in these films is a bit better, though still far from perfect.
Nerf herder!
Which makes it a lot easier overall to buy that these characters have grown to like each other. They already had something of a bond at the end of the first movie, and then there was some development of that over time thanks to years of adventures together, so by the time we meet them again in Empire, there's this will they won't they tension that's already present. They spend half the movie stuck on a ship together, forced to interact with one another, all the while knowing that even if they survive this, he's just gonna leave to pay off his debts and they probably won't ever see each other again. And then they get captured, Han is about to be frozen in carbonite, and Leia finds herself saying the one thing she's been thinking but never thought would actually come out of her mouth.
I love you.
I know.
This is all you need to get the point across. I don't want a scene where Anakin and Padme are about to be wheeled out to their execution and Padme delivers this dreadful excuse of a love confession.
I've been dying a little bit each day since you came back into my life.
What are you talking about?
I love you.
I thought that we had decided not to fall in love and that it would destroy our lives.
I think our lives are about to be destroyed anyway. I truly, deeply love you.
This isn't how people talk, George.
It was extremely romantic.
It almost feels unfair to compare these two relationships since one is from a far better movie. But I think it speaks volumes about George Lucas as a creative and his limitations therein that this is what we end up with when it's a movie he wrote. I've already said that George is at his best when he has other people around him to guide his ideas in ways that work. He's not good at writing dialogue, so let someone else do that part. It's okay, there's no shame in it. I'd much prefer he brings in someone who actually knows how humans talk than end up with something like this.
You're so beautiful.
It's only because I'm so in love.
No. No, it's because I'm so in love with you.
So love has blinded you?
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
But anyway, I feel like I'm skipping ahead. So, Anakin and Padme are on Tatooine burying his mother, which is another scene I really like, by the way. Everything about the loss of his mom and how that affects him going forward is good stuff, and I only wish it was developed more, but we'll get into that more in the next movie. Then they're informed that Obi-Wan has sent a message, and this is where the plot lines finally start to reconverge. Once we get to Geonosis, things really take a nosedive, especially in what's possibly the single worst scene in this entire movie, the droid factory. Here's a fun fact about the droid factory sequence I learned while watching the behind-the-scenes docs as research for this video. George Lucas came up with it at basically the last minute and then forced his VFX artists to work around the clock just to bring it to life in a nearly insurmountable deadline.
After I'd say the first cut, George felt there was a little bit that needed to take place in Reel 5.
The kinetic energy of the movie had picked up to the point where we were starting to get some momentum, and to stop and have dialogue at that point just didn't work.
The droid factory sequence came up, 8 or 9 months into the editing of the film. It was never originally part of the story.
So one day we get this call from George, hey, come on downstairs, I've got an idea for a new sequence.
Because these sequences were envisioned and put together well after principal photography was actually done, we had a lot less time to actually do them.
And they all went just absolutely nuts. I think they were working 20, 22 hours a day, sleeping upstairs, and they came out with this remarkable scene.
The way these people talk about such horrible work conditions in this cavalier way, as if it was fun and exciting, really speaks volumes to how overworked and underpaid our VFX workers are. More and more in this industry, producers and directors are finding new ways to cut costs and overload their underlings with work they're not equipped to handle in the time they're given. And so not only are they suffering under the weight of all that, we end up getting less than ideal results in modern media. Films and shows with massive budgets produced by some of the largest companies in the world continue to generate effects that hardly look better than that which you might find in a PS2 game. And I think at least some of that can be traced back to the way people like George Lucas treated their workers back in the halcyon days of CGI and visual effects being used in the digital arena. I'm certainly no expert on the subject, and I'm not even going to try to pretend otherwise. All I can really say is that one of the largest complaints leveled against the prequels as a whole, but especially Attack of the Clones, was that the VFX looked, frankly, rubbish. Yoda particularly is a major complaint, given that he's one of the most prominent digital characters in the film, and the artists tasked with bringing him to life had much being asked of them. Seriously, if you watch the behind the scenes, it might astonish you just how anal Lucas was about getting this one small shot of Yoda exactly right, only for it to still not really look very good because Yoda just doesn't look good generally in this film. I'm not here trying to dunk on the use of CGI as opposed to practical effects. My stance is and has always consistently been that both are mere tools that are neither good nor bad, and whatever the scene calls for should dictate which one is used. The Balrog in Fellowship of the Ring was never going to look good practically, and the CG version ended up being used to great effect in the final product. Similarly, there are a lot of things from the prequels that demanded to be done digitally, and I would have had it no other way. Even Yoda, based on some of the things he had to do in this movie that would not have worked if they'd gone with the puppet. Especially that puppet. So no, I'm not critiquing that this film heavily relied on CGI and blue screen. I just take umbrage with the way a lot of it was handled behind the camera. But with that said, let's actually take a look at the sequence that demanded so much of the artists. George was so hell-bent on getting this scene in the movie by the release deadline, so it better be worth its buck, right? Well, I suppose it should be the obvious conclusion that the VFX don't look good, given everything we just went over. But again, I don't really blame the artists for that. They did the best they could with what little time they had, and this is a massive sequence that demanded a lot from them. But there's more to it than that. The actual logistics are very poor, and a lot of that's down to the direction, so let's dive into that. Anakin and Padme sneak into the factory through a little side door and immediately get swarmed by Geonosians, causing them to rush out into the main catacomb and onto the tiniest little platform you've ever seen that's meant to extend into a bridge. I guess it makes sense that this thing is so narrow since all the Geonosians can just fly wherever they want to go, but then that raises the question of why there's a bridge here at all and why it's not always extended. But then again, I could ask that question about A New Hope as well, and we all know if it happened in one of the good movies, it's not allowed to be criticized. In any case, Padme's clumsy ass falls right onto the conveyor belt, and Anakin jumps down to go rescue her. From there, things get even weirder. Padme is being moved toward these big smashy things, and instead of just running back in the direction of Anakin, which she can easily do given the speed at which this belt is moving, she decides to rush forward into the danger. She does this a few times until she and Anakin are thoroughly separated, which shouldn't be so much of an issue since Anakin knows which direction she went in and can easily follow, but for some reason he doesn't do that and instead jumps down to a different conveyor belt, so Padme's on her own, I guess. Meanwhile, R2 and 3PO decide to join the party, and because 3PO won't get out of his way, R2 just decides he's gonna fucking murder him, and I think that's an incredibly interesting writing decision. I guess the little sociopath doesn't really care all that much about 3PO at this point since they basically just met, and no, I'm not counting the few times they interacted like 10 years ago, and he wants to get out there as quickly as possible to help Anakin and Padme. But I'm gonna remember this moment the next time I watch A New Hope and want to feel any emotion toward 3PO offering to donate his parts to restore R2 after the Battle of Yavin. I always took that moment to mean that while the two might bicker, they still really care about one another and would do anything for each other. I guess Threeps didn't get the memo, though. Not to worry, though, there was conveniently a droid flying just below the area in time to catch 3PO and then drop him into the depths of hell. Then a bunch of bullshit happens to get 3PO into the line of battle droids being constructed, and I'm gonna be a real asshole with how pedantically I nitpick this, but only because I don't think the battle droid 3PO bit is in any way funny, so the payoff was not worth all the contrivances that facilitated it. He gets his head lobbed off by a robot arm, then he kind of stumbles his way onto the line, despite there being a large gap between these two areas that he should have fallen into. There might be a little piece of ground that connects them both here, I can't really tell, but even then I'd say it's convenient that 3PO chose that specific spot to walk, considering the whole joke is that he's walking around blind.
I'm so confused.
You and me both, man. And don't think I was just gonna skip past the fact that R2 can apparently fucking fly now. People like to make fun of this complaint as though it's just OT purists getting their panties in a bunch over small, inconsequential changes, which is kinda how I would categorize things like Yoda engaging in lightsaber combat, but we'll get to that later. But I think R2 being able to fly all of a sudden isn't nothing. There are moments in the original films where him being able to do that would have been extremely useful. People like to appeal to off-screen shit like, oh, maybe the rockets got broken between trilogies, or Bail Organa decided to take them away from him for some reason. But I think I've more than made my stance clear what I think of all that. If it's not in the films, or at least reasonably implied, I don't care. Also, this is a side note, but there are a distracting amount of times in this movie where R2 is forced to negotiate a flight of stairs, and it always cuts away before showing it, and he somehow manages to keep up with the people he's following. I guess we have to just assume he flew past them, even though in some shots we can at least see him attempting to do it the right way. The reason I bring it up, though, is because there actually is a shot in A New Hope where we briefly see him trying to trundle down some stairs, and it's really funny. Frankly, I consider it cowardice on Lucas's part that he strayed away from ever having to depict this epic battle on screen in later installments. Anyway, checking back in with our main characters, let's see how they're doing. Some bullshit happened that I don't even really know how to describe that caused Anakin to get his arm stuck underneath some kind of metal thing. Like, seriously, I've watched this movie dozens of times throughout my life and have never been able to figure out what the fuck happened here. I even took it into my editor, slowed it down, and went frame by frame, and the best I can come up with is that his arm is somehow encased in this part here, and somehow didn't get crushed by the big smashy thing. I can't imagine any version of this where his arm isn't reduced to jelly, but it actually gets even funnier. A minute later, this large blade chops into it and cuts right through the metal, completely severing Anakin's lightsaber. But again, his hand and arm remain completely intact, for now anyway. There's just a general bit of plot armor that all these characters have throughout the sequence. 3PO with basically all the bullshit I laid out a minute ago, Anakin with this, it's really lucky his head was just far enough away to not get smashed like his arm should have been. And Padme gets a healthy dose of it when a Geonosian knocks her into some kind of barrel thing that then gets taken over to a different part of the factory to be filled up with molten lava. R2 rescues her just in the nick of time, like literally right at the exact moment she was about to be killed. Very lucky. I guess that justifies him killing C-3PO so that he could get him out of the way. Otherwise, R2 would have been too late to save Padme. I can unironically imagine someone making that point, so I've elected to laugh at it prematurely. George stated that the reason he added this sequence was because of the pacing. He felt that some momentum had been built up without any kind of climax, and so that's what the droid factory scene was meant to resolve. But to be honest, man, I don't think you needed to do this much to facilitate that. You already brought the actors back for reshoots. Just write a quick scene where they get swarmed by Geonosians, try to make a run for it, but ultimately get captured, which is basically what happens anyway, just without all this needless bullshit. The only thing that really changes if you take this out is, again, the C-3PO battle droid joke, but seeing as that adds nothing other than some light comedy during the arena battle, I say we can do without that. Or if you really want that for some reason, just pull an Empire and have him wander away from the group and then get blasted to hell and reconfigured onto the droid's body. You don't need to do all this. I talked about some of the logistical problems, but really my biggest takeaway is that the droid factory sequence is just messy. There's just too much going on. All these crazy moving parts and big machinery swinging around make for a disorienting feeling, which I suppose is kind of the point. point. It seems like they were going for it being overwhelming, even to a Jedi character trying to navigate through. But I think at a certain point, less is more. And contrary to what Rick McCallum seems to believe, just because you can pack a million things in each and every shot doesn't mean you should, or that it'll make it better.
You have to see the film 2 or 3 times. It's so dense. There's so many different things that are going on in each frame.
If the Naboo escape sequence in episode 1 is bad because it's low energy and directed sluggishly, then Droid Factory has the exact opposite problem. There's a little gray area in there, and that's where you operate. So the good guys get captured and reunited with Obi-Wan out in the arena, where they're about to be executed by a bunch of monsters that the Geonosians just have on hand here. You get the impression, based on the setting and menagerie, that this is meant to be reminiscent of a gladiator-style spectacle. They aren't just being executed, they are the entertainment. But I'm not really sure what the Separatists were expecting them to do while chained to these pillars. Why not at least let them run around trying to evade the monsters and give the Geonosians an actual show? And it's not like they were anticipating that the Jedi would break free, or at the very least it doesn't seem like Gunray was expecting that to happen, given how he reacted when it did. Looking at this from Dooku's perspective, making a spectacle out of the execution of these characters rather than just chopping their heads off privately is an intentional maneuver to make a statement to the Republic, but he also arranged it this way to drag it out so the Jedi would attack them with their new army, thus officially starting the war. It works a lot better as a narrative if the Republic are the ones who started it, and he can justify their executions on the basis that Padme was snooping around their factories uninvited as a form of espionage, which then provokes the Jedi into trying to rescue them. That's all to say, it doesn't really matter to him one way or another if Anakin, Obi-Wan, or Padme dies here, so I say why not draw it out as much as you can by arming them and giving them a fighting chance. I guess it doesn't really matter since they break free anyway, but I just think it's a strange choice. There's a lot to cover about this battle on a meta level that I feel now is worth getting into. The first thing, of course, is the fact that the Battle of Geonosis is what kicked off the galactic-scale conflict that would come to be known as the Clone Wars.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
A conflict baked into legend decades after it ended that even a random farm boy on the outskirts of civilization would come to associate with the term Jedi Knight. And finally, 25 years after this concept was first introduced, we're finally being shown on screen what exactly these Clone Wars were.
Clone War.
Clone War, I guess. It's just the one war, after all. Now, I have my issues with the way the prequels decided to handle the Clone Wars. Issues that I mainly take with Episode 3, but some that I think are larger problems plaguing the whole trilogy, so it's worth taking a step back and examining it now that they've begun. The first is hardly a new or original take, but I'm of the belief that this war really should have gotten started in Episode 1, and not at the tail end of the second-to-last film in the trilogy. This war was a massive deal that would go on to define the downfall of the Jedi Order and Republic, and the subsequent rise of the Empire and birth of Darth Vader, and we barely see any of it. Yeah, we got a TV show fleshing it out, but in the films themselves, we get this one battle, and then throughout Revenge of the Sith, we only really hear about the conflict as something happening elsewhere, far away. Even the Battle of Coruscant, which opened the film, kind of felt like its own isolated incident. Despite happening above the capital planet of the Republic, which serves as a setting for a good bulk of the film, you never really see Coruscant having been affected by the battle that took place in their skies. There isn't any kind of carnage or scarring, there aren't injured people and Jedi dealing with relief efforts. It happened, the Jedi stopped it, and it basically didn't have any consequences. Even killing Count Dooku didn't really seem to accomplish anything as far as the film was concerned. And again, these are more issues I take with Revenge of the Sith, but the point of bringing it up now is that the Clone Wars were treated as a big deal, and served as the backbone for the destruction of a regime that had stood for over 1,000 generations, and we barely see any of it. We barely even meet more than a couple of those clones we've heard so much about. All we're really taught by the movies themselves is vaguely how the war got started and why, and how they ended, which I guess are the two most important parts, but there's an entire middle chunk there that just happened off screen. The other major criticism I have with the Clone Wars is how little time in galactic history it actually covers. It only went on for 3 years, which you can and should argue is an issue with Revenge of the Sith for only setting itself 3 years after Attack of the Clones, but it's also true that had the war gotten started in Phantom Menace, then by the time of Episode 2, it would have been in full effect for some time already. We'd be able to better explore a lot of the stuff I've already gone over in this video, like how the Jedi view Count Dooku and what he told Obi-Wan about the Sith controlling the Republic. What would they think about their role in the war, especially with the prospect that it might be serving their greatest enemy by fighting in it at all? Why do the Senate so readily accept Palpatine as their leader when the time comes for him to declare himself Emperor? Maybe we could see what the state of galactic politics looked like at this point when Palpatine had been their wartime leader for some years now. Maybe they view him as the glue holding it all together and continue giving him more time in office because they're scared of what might happen if he steps down while the war is still waging. I mentioned in my Clone Wars video that the war should have lasted longer than 3 years, but obviously I didn't blame the show itself for that. It was only working with the time frame it had been given, but I will criticize it here, because these movies set the foundation for this entire era, and they easily could have written it differently. And I'm not saying necessarily that you have to cut Maul out or anything. The prequels themselves are the ones that establish the rule of two as a thing, so you don't have to adhere to that if you're reworking these films. But I'd like to see Dooku as a presence across all three of them, just because it would do a better job making them feel more cohesive, but also because, as I'm sure you can all guess by now, I think he's woefully underdeveloped in the actual story we got, despite being super interesting in concept. He's got personal connections to two of the main characters through Qui-Gon, as well as being a prodigal son type former student of Yoda's who was well respected by everyone in the Order. So already there's some deeply interesting conflict to explore without even getting into the political intrigue he represents. This is much more of a soft rewrite compared to some of the ideas I was throwing around earlier. I don't know exactly what this version of the films would look like, but I just think it was a wasted opportunity having this all play out as it does. Sorry, George, it's not impressive just because you threw several dozen Jedi on screen and had them run around chopping up a cavalcade of mindless robots. It's all style over substance, and not even particularly good style. The choreography across the arena battle is a mess, and the rest of the battle isn't all that much better. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason to any of the army's movements on both sides. The troops aren't even taking cover. It looked cool and cinematic watching a bunch of clones spray blaster fire into a sandstorm, but tactically nothing about this battle makes any sense. Here's something I like though. This shot of Boba picking up his dad's helmet and pressing it to his head is neat, and it gives off the first steps down a dark path vibe that I think it was going for. I still maintain there was absolutely no reason to have a Boba Fett origin story in this movie, and that Jango could have easily been replaced by any other bounty hunter with a different name, but still. I like this shot, and it's about one of the only things I can really praise about this battle.
This is such a drag.
Fuck you. Anyway, I guess when writing this, George realized he needed a lightsaber fight to cap off the movie, and obviously he wanted it to be between Dooku and our main characters. So instead of doing any work to have Anakin and Obi-Wan figure out where Dooku is or where he's heading, they kind of just accidentally bump into him while in their gunship. But they can't fire on him now because they're all out of rockets. That's unlucky. This forces them to chase him to his destination at the landing platform, though I'm not even sure why they bothered with all that when all Yoda had to do was vaguely sense that something was going on and from there knew exactly where to go. I get that he's supposed to be extremely powerful, but this all just feels super convenient. Speaking of convenience, I guess George also realized he didn't really want Padme or the clones to be there when the fight happened. He just wants it to be between the Jedi and the Sith, so they gotta go. He can kill the nameless clones off easily enough by just having the gunship get fucking obliterated the second Obi-Wan and Anakin step off, but obviously that won't do for getting rid of Padme, so for her, we'll just have the ship get rocked a little bit, and in keeping with the theme of Padme being clumsy, she just falls right out. Thank God this happened right here when they weren't too far off the ground and below was nothing but soft sand dunes, rather than about 20 seconds later when they were flying over this terrain. If it sounds like I'm nitpicking, I'm mostly just poking fun here. My ultimate point is that George really wanted this lightsaber battle to happen in a very specific way, but couldn't be bothered to come up with ways to facilitate that outcome naturally with the way the rest of this had been set up. Honestly though, I don't really know that every Star Wars movie needs a lightsaber duel, you know? Like, there was one in each of the originals and two in the last movie, but those all happened naturally in the story. Vader was actively searching for Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan understood that he would need to confront Vader so he could serve as a distraction so the rest of the group could get away. Luke facing Vader on Cloud City was literally orchestrated so that that exact outcome would happen. Vader lured Luke into a trap and fought him so he could take his measure. The Attack of the Clones fight did not occur naturally in the story, which means now there's extra pressure for this fight to be good. You wanted it to happen, so it better not be choreographed like shit. Oh. I guess one might argue that this fight needed to happen so that Anakin could get his arm cut off, even though we kind of already went over a moment where that already should have happened anyway. But again, I'm not even saying you can't have this fight happen, just do a better job reworking your script so that it comes about organically. In any case, Dooku kicks the shit out of Anakin and Obi-Wan in a way that I think works pretty well in showcasing how disorganized they are as a duo at this point, mainly due to the non-constructive ways in which Obi-Wan has taken his role as Anakin's mentor. Yes, Anakin was impulsive with how he charged at at Dooku, but some of the blame belongs to Obi-Wan for the fact that his apprentice no longer listens to him when he shouts at him to stop and think. When all you do is criticize and nag and never show even an ounce of genuine praise, eventually he's just gonna tune you out, and I really like how that ultimately came back to bite him in the ass. If this movie was meant to show how aloof they are as a pair, Revenge of the Sith was there to show how far they'd come since then as brothers, only to eventually come apart in the end, and I think all that's pretty neat. But then comes the part that everyone likes to criticize, and I have a lot to say about Yoda in these movies. But so does everyone else, and I must say, some of the discourse I've seen surrounding this character is rather shit. Many people don't like this version of Yoda because they see a massive juxtaposition with how he's depicted in the original trilogy as this old, wise sage who deeply understands the Force and is kind of above it all because of how long he's lived and how much he's seen. He's the mentor to the mentor, and he's so incomprehensibly old that you almost don't even believe he was ever as young and inexperienced as Luke is. Even when Obi-Wan was young, he was ancient. So I think people look at that and they see how he's depicted in the prequels, and it just doesn't sit right with them that he's not nearly so zen and wise. He's actually a huge fool who gets duped into a war that costs countless lives and all but tears the Jedi Order apart. He gets things wrong, he resorts to violence, and he falls from grace. Of course, I don't necessarily agree with the interpretation that Yoda is this wizened sage who knows everything about everything in the OT. People seem to forget that he and Obi-Wan were trying to train Luke up to destroy the Sith and restore the Jedi Order. They wanted him to kill his father, and Luke had to be the one to realize they were wrong, that there's a better way. But I do take your meaning. Yoda obviously learned a lot from his failures in the prequels and came out of it a wiser, more self-reflective man. He understands that war is not what makes one great, and he knows that a Jedi should use the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. These are lessons he imparts upon Luke, and he's right, but people don't seem to realize that Yoda not abiding by these doctrines in the prequels isn't some kind of contradiction or oversight. That's the whole fucking point. It reads to me like people assumed Yoda would be about the same as he was in the originals in terms of wisdom and understanding, because, again, he's so incomprehensibly old. Even at this point, he's in his late 800s, which, relatively speaking, isn't really any younger than he is in Empire, so if he's the sage mentor in the OT, then he must be the sage mentor in the prequels too. I think a lot of people really just can't square away the idea that someone as old and experienced as Yoda would ever make such mistakes or give in to his own hubris, but I mean, I don't really know what to tell ya, he just does. And that's kind of the point, right? That's the subversion of what you might have expected going into this trilogy, that even someone like Yoda isn't above the dogma of the Order to which he's pledged his whole life. Yoda's been around the block a few times, but even he was too blind to see what was right in front of him. I think this is pretty good characterization for Yoda, and thematically he represents everything Lucas was trying to say about the pitfalls of the Jedi in these films. He was arrogant, he was foolish, and he fought for ideals that he himself didn't even truly understand, ones that he wouldn't understand fully until Luke showed him there was another way. So when people complain about the fact that he commands soldiers or fights battle droids or engages in lightsaber duels with Dooku and Sidious, the only thing I can really say is, yeah, that's the point. What's wrong with that? But then again, there is another angle to play this whole should Yoda use a lightsaber discussion, which is, yeah? Why shouldn't he? About a year ago, there was this little show called Ahsoka, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. It wasn't very good, I wouldn't recommend. But there was this one scene that happened in episode 7, where a character named Ezra Bridger refused to accept his own lightsaber from his friend Sabine when the time came where they were surrounded by enemy soldiers. Some people argued that he wanted Sabine to have it because she needed something to defend herself with more than he did, despite the fact that she had a pair of blasters that she's easily more adept with. And even accepting that the lightsaber is better used by her, even though she's shown to be far less proficient with one than he is, he could have easily accepted her offer to let him use her blasters. But instead, the stated reason why Ezra refused the lightsaber is this.
The Force is my ally. That's all I need.
This line implies that Ezra believed he didn't need a weapon, because his mastery over the Force would carry him through the situation. A belief that would prove incorrect as he found himself nearly killed several times by armed troops and even lightsaber-wielding agents, until eventually he does have to take hold of a blaster and use it to mow down his enemies. Now, I don't want to rehash everything I said about this scene in my Ahsoka video, because that would just be redundant, but the ultimate point I made there was that Ezra, and by extension Dave Filoni, didn't seem to actually understand what my ally as the Force actually actually means, nor to the audience who defended the scene on Twitter, given many of the arguments they made. And at the time, it reminded me a lot of the Yoda should never use a lightsaber discourse from the olden days where people hurled unfair and poorly thought out criticisms at the prequel trilogy. So I guess we have to be really patronizing here and break down what knowledge and defense mean. Yoda is defending Anakin, Obi-Wan, and himself from Count Dooku right now by engaging in combat with him, as well as potentially ending the war before it can begin, which will save countless lives. So it could be argued from a pragmatic standpoint that he's acting in defense of the entire galaxy right now. It's a bit similar to the face-off between Luke and Vader in the Emperor's throne room, but the key difference that radically changes the context for why one is framed as a dark moment is that Luke is giving into his anger and his hate. If he goes through with striking down Vader, he'll be doing so for the wrong reasons, which is why him throwing his lightsaber to the side and refusing to give Palpatine what he wants is the right move here. It's not just about who you're fighting. It's also important to understand when to put the sword down. But no such context seems to exist in this contest between Yoda and Dooku. There admittedly isn't much happening between them in the scene, because despite these characters having what would likely be a deep personal connection with one another, the films don't really do a good job actually developing their dynamic. Still though, there doesn't seem to be any indication that Yoda is attacking Dooku with any sense of malice. He's doing it to protect people and to prevent further catastrophe, as any Jedi should do. It wouldn't be wrong for Yoda to defeat Dooku here, or even strike him down if necessary, because he isn't doing it out of hate. I think some people fail to understand why this sort of thing is contextual, and why it is a dark moment when Anakin executes Dooku on Grievous's flagship. That was an unnecessary murder of an unarmed prisoner, one who was at his mercy, but simply fighting or killing at all doesn't necessarily equate to the Jedi abandoning their principles, otherwise Obi-Wan would have been reprimanded for killing Darth Maul. And this leads into the larger point here. The first time we ever see a lightsaber in the films, Obi-Wan describes it as the weapon of a Jedi Knight. The Jedi, who were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, would use these weapons when and where necessary to prevent others from being harmed or killed, even if sometimes it meant dealing said harm yourself, as is demonstrated later in the film. Yoda is a Jedi, which means it's his job to preserve the peace in ways that might sometimes get bloody and violent. Why wouldn't he use the weapon of a Jedi Knight to do that? You can argue all you want that it looks bad watching a CGI frog jump around fighting a 30-something guy with fake old person facial hair, but that's a completely separate argument that's beside the point. Yoda using a lightsaber is fine. It makes sense. The thing Dave and the people who defend the new stuff don't seem to understand is that not having a lightsaber isn't actually stopping Ezra from attacking, as it were. Even before he resorts to using the blaster, he still uses hand-to-hand combat, as well as his force powers to fight the stormtroopers in Shin. So even if we're going by this rudimentary understanding of Yoda's teachings in The Empire Strikes Back, then he's still not doing it right. Plus, I feel it's worth reminding you guys that Yoda tried to deal with Dooku without his lightsaber, and that didn't work, so he had to resort to it. What was he supposed to do? Just let them die?
Maybe.
I just think this whole argument is silly, and I hope by now I've done a good job illustrating why. But I want to level with you guys here. I think to an extent, the people who criticize Yoda for not being the wise sage he was in the original movies are kinda onto something. At least insofar as there is an air of mysticism regarding this completely alien creature Luke met in a swamp who taught him things about reality that he never even thought possible. A lot of Yoda's story is shrouded in mystery, even today. We still don't know the name of his species, or where he comes from, or why he talks so funny. Other members of his species that we've met don't talk like that, so what's the deal? Again, this is a character who, to us, is so incredibly old compared to anything we can even really comprehend, and in the original trilogy, that's contextualized with all sorts of implications about where he comes from and what the world was like when he was younger. How much has he seen and done, and how has the world changed since he was a young man? Well, now we have a much better understanding of the Star Wars timeline, and thanks to the prequels, we know a lot more about the Order of the Sith and its history with the Jedi. We know that by the Phantom Menace, they'd been presumed extinct for a millennium, and that's about how long it's been since there was any kind of galactic-scale conflict, thanks to a line said in this film.
There hasn't been a full-scale war since the formation of the Republic.
I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two.
Now, this line from Palpatine and the line from Obi-Wan about how the Jedi and the Republic were around for over 1,000 generations contradict each other, and it's something the books had to work to patch up through various retcons. But my point here is that about 1,000 years before the events of the prequels, the last major conflict occurred that swept the entire galaxy by storm, and which likely involved the Sith in at least some capacity. This conflict would later go on to herald the supposed extinction of the Sith and the formation of the Republic as we know it today, and all that happened before Yoda was even born. By the time he came around, it was an era of peace and relative stability for a galaxy free of the Sith, and I find that to be kind of a wasted opportunity. Like, sure, there were no doubt conflicts and border disputes and things of that nature that the Jedi had to deal with in the intervening centuries, but largely everything was more or less calm and uneventful, and that's the time period that made up the bulk of Yoda's life. So now when I watch the movies, I don't look at this impossibly old man and think, wow, what a life he must have lived, what adventures he must have gone on, what must things have been like in his day, because now I know, it was basically the same as it is now. The state of the world hasn't really changed at all in his lifetime, save for a bit more corruption in the political arena. To me, that kind of diminishes what makes Yoda intriguing, but I also just think it discards what could otherwise have been a very interesting character conflict for him in these films. Imagine Heimerdinger from Arcane, but with Yoda instead. Imagine if this is set at a point where all the rest of the Jedi have been brought up in a world without the threat of the Sith looming over them. Jedi who understand theoretically how bad of a threat they are, but who've never truly understood it. Only Yoda understands, because he's the one Jedi alive today who actually lived through that conflict. If they'd simply tweak the timeline of events so that, say, the Sith went extinct 700 or 800 years ago, and it was during a conflict so large and devastating that it reshaped the galaxy forever and forged the version of the Republic as we know it, if Yoda had simply been there to witness that as a young man, then he would be the only character who fully understands why the Sith can never be allowed to return. And because of this, Yoda continues to take more extreme measures and sacrifice more and more of his principles to ensure this outcome by any means necessary. Basically, just do what you're already doing with him, but have it be supported by personal experience dealing with the Sith in his past. Have him lose his way in an attempt to save the galaxy from the very evil he threatens to become if he continues down this path. It goes back to what I said about Luke in the throne room. How you fight is just as important as why you do it. If once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your
destiny. Consume you it will.
Now, as I already said, I think it's totally valid for you to take issue with the way this fight looks, because it is pretty ridiculous. Originally, they wanted to do it with the puppet, but they realized eventually there was just no way they were going to get that to work, so Yoda had to be digital. And obviously, if he's going to be CGI for the fight, then it would look weird and inconsistent if he didn't look that way for the entire rest of the movie, and thus digital Yoda was born. I've already defended that decision in my last video on the basis that I fucking hate that goddamn puppet they used for the Phantom Menace, with the caveat, of course, that the original version is always available and that the work of the model makers isn't just completely overwritten, which is a serious problem with George. But I've also just always been of the belief that CG Yoda actually looks pretty good in Revenge of the Sith and Phantom Menace. Attack of the Clones Yoda looks like shit, but to me that speaks to the idea that they just didn't have that kind of technology all the way figured out yet, and this just needed a few more years in the oven to cook. Then again, I used the Balrog as an example of good CGI earlier, and that movie came out a year before this one, so who knows why he looks so bad in episode 2. It's probably some sort of combination between not giving the artists enough time to work on the film and dropping an overwhelming workload on them to boot. I mean, there are so many VFX shots in this movie, and a lot of them are pretty packed, so I can't imagine this was a cakewalk. I do not envy these guys. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that, like I said earlier, I've always maintained the belief that neither practical effects nor CGI are inherently superior to the other, and the issues with the prequels are not just that they were supposedly over-reliant on visual effects. When talking about things like the Yoda and Dooku fight, I say it looks bad, and that might cause some of you to say, yeah, and that's why it should never have happened. Yoda should just never use a lightsaber. But I think that's just you outing yourself as someone who can't think creatively about what a lightsaber duel between two powerful Force users could look like. It doesn't have to be him jumping around like a frog. You could actually show how both Yoda and Dooku have mastered their abilities in cool and interesting ways. Having Dooku shoot lightning at Yoda and him catching it and absorbing the energy into his hands is the only thing in this scene that even comes close to that. The rest of it is just Dooku tries to pull some of the ceiling down on him, and then Yoda catches it. And just kind of moves it.
It is obvious that this contest cannot be decided by our knowledge of the Force.
I mean, if you say so. You barely even tried. While we're on the subject of digitizing Yoda, though, I figure now's a good time to mention some facts I find interesting about the production of this movie. According to a now-deleted StarWars.com article interviewing Rob Coleman, they didn't want to rebuild the whole set for the Jedi Council Chamber because they only needed it for one scene, so they literally just reused the same shots from the Phantom Menace and superimposed Attack of the Clones, Anakin, and Obi-Wan over Phantom Menace, Obi-Wan, and Qui-Gon. Because of this, they decided to take the opportunity to just replace a couple council members that you saw in the first movie. The first one everyone knows about thanks to Robot Chicken.
They didn't have calamari pizza because Mon Calamari are people, and I did not know that.
George decided to get rid of him because he thought his design was too similar to that of the Kaminoans, and he was worried that would confuse audiences. And you know, I feel like I should feel insulted by that, but honestly, I kinda get it. If I've learned anything from running this channel and interacting with Star Wars fans, it's that a lot of them are kind of fucking stupid. So they got rid of him and replaced him with Coleman Trebor, this rad-as-hell dinosaur dude who gets absolutely blitzed by Jango Fett during the battle. The other Jedi who gets replaced is Yaddle, and the reason for that was because, again, they had to go with a digital Yoda throughout the movie, and they thought it would look weird if he was CGI, but Yaddle was still a puppet. I guess they couldn't be asked to just make a CG model for her, so instead they replaced her with Shaak Ti, a character based on an unused concept design for the Sith antagonist who would eventually become Dooku. I can totally get behind making this change for the sake of visual consistency, but it does bother me somewhat that he went back to make Yoda CGI in The Phantom Menace back in 2011, but kept puppet Yaddle. Like, George. But anyway, I bring all that up because I just find a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff fascinating to watch, and some of my favorite parts about working on these videos has been going through that stuff and seeing how these films were made. There's so much passion and creativity behind them, and even when I find even more reasons to lose respect for George, I can at least appreciate how much talent did go into them, regardless of the final result. It's just nice to see the process behind certain things that I've always taken for granted, because I've seen these movies so many times since I was old enough to even remember. But I guess I should probably find some way to wrap this into some kind of conclusion, shouldn't I? I've more or less talked about everything that I think needs to be said about this film, and the last thing I want to do in this nearly 2-hour video is waste anyone's time, so I guess here goes. Much like its predecessor and follow-up, Attack of the Clones is a film with a lot of really good ideas that are unfortunately just not well executed. It's a movie that tries to cover themes that are much deeper than the writing allows for, while also aiming itself toward a demographic of mainly children, and I just don't think it does a very good job meshing those things together. The prequels are often criticized for being boring, which is a point that I hate for any movie because it doesn't really tell me anything, but honestly, I'd say this one is anything but. This movie has way too much going on, and it never allows you even a moment to breathe. The second you even begin to process a slurry of confusing and muddled information thrown in your face, the film is already 10 scenes ahead trying to force feed you even more confusing exposition. Trying to make sense of the vast majority of this plot will leave you with more questions than you had to begin with, and even though I think there are technically valid answers and inferences to a lot of these questions you could raise, I don't think the film does the legwork to properly communicate those answers to its audience. If the main bulk of people who watch this movie can't tell what actually happened and what the characters even know by the time they walk out of the theater, then you failed to do your job as a screenwriter, even if it were to technically make sense once you lay it all out. Because like I said way earlier in this video, I understand to an extent why most people don't seem to understand the plot. I myself only understand it as well as I think I do because I painstakingly comb through the film trying to work it out for myself, and that's why this video took so long to make. I had to constantly revise my script and take notes upon notes upon notes every time I uncovered a deeper layer that recontextualized a criticism or defense that I had. It was kind of exhausting, and honestly, that's a good word to describe this whole movie. Exhausting. It's a film that wants to cover so much ground and has absolutely no time to develop it all in a way that makes sense. At its core, it wants to be a mix between this romantic soap opera and a kind of spy-esque detective story that merge into this big, plucky action-adventure, and I just don't think any of those elements work at all, so I'm gonna give Star Wars Attack of the Clones a 2.5 out of 10. Not the worst Star Wars movie, but of the prequel trilogy, it's absolutely the weakest. But with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I mean it when I said this video took forever to make. I put the Phantom Menace review out in May, right in time for the 25th anniversary, and originally the plan was to have this one out by the end of the summer and be well into my Revenge of the Sith review by now. But as you can see, that didn't happen, and that's thanks in large part to the fact that I had a really busy summer and there were a lot of things that I felt the need to cover that came out these last few months. So this just kind of had to sit on the back burner a lot. If all goes to plan, this should be premiering at the end of November, but if not, Merry Christmas, I guess. Also, big thanks, of course, to Southpaw for helping edit this video. He's got some good stuff in his library if you want to check out his channel, link in the description. And while we're plugging, I should mention I have a Discord server that everyone tells me I never advertise, even though I know for a fact I've said this exact same thing in multiple other videos, so whatever. Go check that out if you're a fucking movie nerd like me, and if you feel so inclined to financially support me, I have a Patreon, and you can become a channel member and get access to my videos 2 days early. So if that's something that sounds appealing to you, there you go. Otherwise, that's it for today. Goodbye! From the moment I met you, all those years ago, not a day has gone by when I haven't thought of you. And now that I'm with you again, I'm in agony. The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe. I'm haunted by the kiss that you should never have given me. My heart is beating, hoping that that kiss will not become a scar. You're in my very soul, tormenting me. What can I do? I will do anything that you ask.